Living in Nevada doesn't offer much excitement, but my friends and I had found our thrill in urban exploration. We'd hunt down abandoned buildings, forgotten tunnels, and derelict structures, anything that time had left behind. It wasn't about vandalism or breaking the law. It was about discovering places where history had stopped breathing. Charles was the one who always found the most unsettling locations. Quiet and mysterious, he'd appear with coordinates to places that seemed impossible to find. He never explained his methods, and honestly, I never asked. One day, he showed us a screenshot from a sketchy Instagram account. Low followers, blurry photos, and comments that made my skin crawl. The post simply read, "Dozens of abandoned mine shafts in the Mojave Desert, if you know where to look." Charles had been messaging with whoever ran the account, and they'd given him some areas to explore. That was all he needed. By Saturday, Charles, James, and I were loading into my Wrangler, heading into the vast emptiness of the Mojave. We had no real address, just a general area and a pin dropped in the middle of nowhere. The drive took us off the main road for almost an hour, following what barely qualified as a dirt path. No signs, no structures, no landmarks, just endless desert stretching to the horizon. James was getting increasingly agitated, calling Charles an idiot for trusting some random internet troll. But Charles was stubborn about navigation, and I figured I'd humor him a little longer. Just as we were about to turn back, James spotted something to our right. At first it looked like more rock and sand, but as we approached, we could make out a half-collapsed wooden structure built into a hillside. Part of the entrance had caved in, but behind the rotting support beams, a dark hole yawned like an open mouth. It was definitely man-made, definitely a mine shaft. Charles quietly marked our GPS location and turned to James with a smug "told you so." Even I had to admit, finding an actual mine shaft in the middle of nowhere felt impossible, yet here we were. I parked on a flat patch of dirt, and we geared up. Charles had even brought masks, which seemed overly cautious at the time. We approached the entrance, and Charles tossed a rock into the darkness. We waited, then heard it clang 3 times before silence swallowed the sound. "If we trip going down, we're probably dead," Charles said matter-of-factly. The shaft wasn't a straight drop, but sloped down at a steep angle. The ground was loose and treacherous, lined with old wooden beams that were surprisingly sturdy. As we descended, the temperature dropped and an oppressive quiet settled around us. The entrance light faded until we were completely swallowed by darkness. Eventually, we reached the bottom where the shaft opened into a wider tunnel system. It looked exactly like something from a horror movie: rotting support beams, rusted rails buried in dirt, and thick dust coating everything. Scraps of metal and wood littered the ground, remnants of mining equipment long abandoned. The stale air made me grateful for the masks Charles had insisted on. We chose a tunnel and began exploring. There wasn't much to see. The place had been stripped of anything valuable decades ago. But then we heard something that made my blood freeze. A scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the ground. At first I thought I'd imagined it, but Charles had stopped too. James motioned for us to kill our flashlights, plunging us into absolute darkness. We stood there, barely breathing, listening to that horrible scraping sound getting closer. Then James accidentally flicked his flashlight on and off again. The scraping stopped. Complete silence. Then came a loud metallic clang from deep in the tunnel, like whatever was being dragged had been dropped. What followed was the most inhuman scream I'd ever heard. Demonic, guttural, barely recognizable as coming from anything that had once been human. We ran. I've never moved faster in my life. Behind us, I could hear footsteps, not quite human. Footsteps, but something trying to mimic the sound of running. I was bringing up the rear when I tripped, my shoe coming off as I struggled to stay upright. There was no time to retrieve it. Climbing out of that mineshaft barefoot was agony. Every step drove splinters and sharp rocks into my foot, but the adrenaline kept me moving. Charles and James had to help carry me to the car once we reached the surface. James drove us straight to the nearest hospital while I tried not to pass out from the pain. I needed a tetanus shot and had dozens of splinters removed from my foot. I couldn't walk normally for days. A few days later, James realized he'd dropped his wallet during our escape, probably while helping me to the car. Against our better judgment, we decided to drive back just to the entrance, not inside the mine. James's wallet was nowhere to be found, but we did discover something else. My missing shoe was sitting a few feet from the mine entrance, torn to shreds. There were clear bite marks in the leather, and entire chunks had been ripped away. We didn't stick around to investigate further. None of us can explain what we encountered down there. You might say it was just a homeless person living in the mine, but how would they survive? There was no food, no water, nothing to sustain human life. Charles tried messaging that Instagram account again, but never got a response. The account eventually disappeared entirely. It's going to be a long time before I do any urban exploring in the desert again. Some places are abandoned for a reason, and some things are better left undisturbed in the darkness where they belong. I've always been drawn to the wilderness, while others dream of luxury resorts and spa weekends. My idea of paradise is a sleeping bag under the stars, with nothing but the sounds of nature for company. My girlfriend Tiki shares this passion, which is probably why we clicked so well from the start. A couple of weeks ago, we decided to try something different. Instead of our usual mountain or forest camping trips, we'd venture into the desert. Neither of us had experienced the unique isolation that only the desert can offer, that vast, silent emptiness that stretches beyond the horizon. The main draw was the stargazing. We'd spent countless nights lying on the hood of my truck, watching meteors streak across unpolluted skies. When I found a campsite online that promised complete remoteness and zero light pollution, it was an easy decision. The spot was 3 hours from civilization, with the last hour on a dirt road that seemed to lead to the edge of the world. No houses, no signs of human life, just the kind of isolation we craved. The first 2 nights were perfect. Warm days melted into cool evenings under a canopy of stars, so bright it hurt to look at them. We'd sit by our campfire, sharing drinks and conversation, completely disconnected from the modern world. It felt like therapy for the soul. Both nights, though, we heard something strange in the distance. A low, drawn-out sound, like a howl, mixed with a human moan. It was unsettling, but we rationalized it as desert wildlife. Coyotes, maybe, or some other animal we weren't familiar with. The third night changed everything. I woke to the soft crunch of footsteps outside our tent. Not the random padding of an animal, but deliberate, measured steps, unmistakably human. My heart hammered against my ribs as I lay frozen, afraid to even breathe. The footsteps stopped just feet from our tent. I wanted to wake Tiki, to grab the flashlight, to do something, but I couldn't move. Every muscle in my body had locked up with primal fear. We waited in that horrible silence, me staring at the tent ceiling, praying whoever was out there would just leave. Then I heard the flick of a lighter. A small orange glow appeared through the tent fabric, waist high and maybe 3 feet away. Whoever was out there held the flame steady, then began waving it around slowly, deliberately. The light grew brighter, much brighter, like they'd lit something larger without warning. They dropped whatever was burning. I heard it hit the dirt with a dull thump. And suddenly our tent was bathed in flickering light. The heat came fast and intense. Within seconds, flames began spreading across the tent fabric. That's what finally broke my paralysis. I shook Tiki awake, and she immediately understood the danger. We scrambled to save what we could, tossing our belongings out of the burning tent. Tiki grabbed a water jug and doused the flames while I stomped out anything that had caught fire. We managed to contain it, but half our tent was destroyed. I grabbed the flashlight and swept it around the campsite, searching for our attacker. Nothing. Whoever had tried to kill us had vanished into the darkness. We packed frantically and started walking toward where we thought we'd parked the truck. In the darkness, with no landmarks to guide us, we were essentially guessing. After 10 minutes of stumbling through the desert, it became clear we were lost. That's when we heard it again, that same distant scream from the previous nights. But this time, it didn't stop. It continued, like an animal in constant agony. Then another scream joined it from a different direction. Then another dot, multiple sources, multiple things, all behind us. I grabbed Tiki's arm and we moved faster, fighting the urge to run and potentially get more lost. By some miracle, we found the truck. We threw our gear in the back and I drove off as fast as the rough dirt road would allow. I couldn't speed too much. The road was treacherous in the dark, and every dip or turn threatened to flip us. When we finally hit the main road and saw other cars, I didn't stop speeding until we reached town. Tiki was holding it together, but I could see she was close to breaking down. I wasn't doing much better. We reported everything to the police, though I'm not sure they believed our story. All I know is that if I hadn't been such a light sleeper, if I hadn't woken up when those footsteps approached our tent, Tiki and I might have been burned alive in the middle of the desert. The official report probably lists it as vandalism or harassment by locals, but I know what I experienced. Those weren't random troublemakers, they were hunters, and we were their prey. I still love camping, but I'll never venture into such complete isolation again. Some places are too far from help, too far from civilization's protective embrace. In the desert, under that vast sky, you realize how small and vulnerable you really are. And sometimes, you're not alone out there in the darkness, even when you think you are. My mother has always been a mystery wrapped in polite deflection and knowing smiles. Born in Mexico, she moved to the States alone for college and never looked back. She met my father, built a life here, and rarely spoke of her past. Not because she forgot it, but because she actively buried it. Growing up, I accepted my father's explanation that she'd experienced childhood trauma best left undiscussed. But as I got older, I began to notice how skillfully she dodged any questions about her life before America. It wasn't just reluctance, it was a masterclass in conversational misdirection. Here's what I managed to piece together. She grew up in a border town in northern Mexico along the Texas frontier. Her father worked for the government in some vague capacity. Her mother was never mentioned, not once. The only personal detail she ever shared was a joke she'd tell at family gatherings, that her father's side were politicians and her mother's side were crooks. but she could never tell which was which. As I grew older, I began to wonder if there was more truth to that statement than humor. The only other clue was a name. I'll call him R to protect identities. When I was 10 or 11, I woke up one night needing the bathroom and heard my mother speaking quietly in the living room. She was speaking Spanish, which wasn't unusual, but she kept repeating this name, R, over and over, not like she was talking to someone, but talking about someone. Curiosity got the better of me, and I flipped on the light switch. She didn't startle or react with surprise. Instead, she calmly hung up the phone and fixed me with a look I'd never seen before. Cold, calculating, almost dangerous. She told me to go back to bed, and I did, though sleep didn't come easily. That was nearly 20 years ago. What happened almost a year ago has haunted me ever since. I was driving through the Arizona desert, making the long trek to visit an old college friend. Hours of empty highways stretched ahead, and I was cycling through. Phone calls to pass the time. Eventually, I called my mum, and we fell into our usual conversation about soccer. One of the few topics that could keep us talking for hours. That's when I saw them. 2 pickup trucks blocking the road ahead. It didn't look like an accident, and I wasn't sure what I was seeing. Thinking someone might need help, I slowed down as I approached. My mum was still chattering about Champions League fixtures when 3 men with guns emerged from the vehicles. I froze. Behind me, another car was quickly approaching, boxing me in. I was unarmed, alone, and completely at their mercy. One of the men tapped his gun against my window, motioning for me to get out. I raised my hands and complied slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The other 2 stood back, weapons ready, while the man barked commands in Spanish that I couldn't understand, my inability to speak. My mother's native language had always embarrassed me, but in that moment, it felt like a death sentence. They took my phone, keys, wallet, everything. One of them got into my truck, and I watched helplessly as they prepared to strand me in the middle of nowhere. But then something strange happened. The man in my truck didn't hang up my phone. Instead, he seemed to be listening. I could see through the window that he was having a conversation with my mother, who was still on the line. I watched his lips move as he spoke rapid Spanish. At one point, I swear, I saw him repeat the name R, the same name I'd heard my mother say all those years ago, like he was confirming he'd heard it correctly. The conversation didn't last long, but it changed everything. The man rolled down the window and spoke to his companions. All 3 turned to stare at me, as if seeing me for the first time, sizing me up in a completely different way. Then, incredibly, they handed everything back to me: phone, keys, wallet, well, almost everything. They kept the cash, but one of them looked at me, smiled, and said in heavily accented English, "Consider it tax." As I drove away, shaking with adrenaline and confusion, all 3 vehicles sped off into the desert, away from the road. None of them had license plates. When I called my mother back, demanding an explanation, she claimed she'd simply threatened to call the police, saying she was tracking my location and knew exactly where I was. It was obviously bullshit, but she stuck to her story no matter how much I pressed. She insisted most of their Spanish conversation was just her pleading her case. When I asked her to call the police for me, she said she would, but I suspect she never did. I tried to block the experience from my mind, but I can't anymore. I'm becoming increasingly certain that my mother had ties to a Mexican cartel or gang during her youth, and, more terrifyingly, that those ties never really ended when she left Mexico, the way those men reacted when they heard whatever she told them, the way they immediately changed their treatment of me. The mysterious R from my childhood. It all points to connections that run deeper and darker than I ever imagined. She knows I'm not stupid, so I don't know how much longer she expects this charade to continue. Part of me wants to confront her directly, demand the truth about her past and what she said to those men that saved my life. But I'm terrified of what kind of world I might be stepping into if she actually tells me. Some family secrets exist for good reasons, and some truths are more dangerous than the lies that hide them. All I know for certain is that my mother isn't the woman I thought she was, and the life she built in America might not be as disconnected from her Mexican past as she's always claimed. Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we know the least, and sometimes that's exactly how they want it.